Last lecture, let's talk about some of the things that might get in the way of children being able to play, and our particular focus will be on barriers to play at school. So to get our mental juices flowing, there is a Padlet that you can do, or you can just answer the question on your own. But if you could take a moment to either open the Padlet or write down on a piece of paper at least 5 reasons why you think that children might not have easy access to play at school. So what are things that happen in schools that might get in the way of children being able to participate in the play-based opportunities that hopefully by now you are convinced are developmentally beneficial for children during their learning. So I wanted to start with a more macro lens and note that the social context of any given time period, along with the political context, and sometimes this is referred to as the socio-political context, matters. So what is going on at the wider cultural level trickles down into schools. And so if folks at the more macro level are having different conversations about what children need in school, that influences politicians and decision making, and often becomes sort of what teachers need to be doing. So I want you to understand that elementary school as a whole, but I'm just going to talk about kindergarten in particular right now. Education, particularly public education of young children, is absolutely influenced by the socio-political realm at any given time period in history. So if we go way back to the early 1900s, kindergarten wasn't really even a thing then, and this is sort of when kindergarten emerged due to the work of people like Froebel. And so there was this realization that younger children could potentially be involved in public schools, and what kindergarten looked like even at that time period was driven by sort of the thinkers of the day, the politics of the day. So there was a gentleman named John Dewey, and John Dewey very much believed that we need to have democratic educational opportunities available for children because we were a new democracy, and if we want to make sure that all of our citizens are ready to participate in that democracy, we need to give them the tools and skills needed. So he was very much about free choice and exercising control over your independent learning. So it was much more of a play-based, child-directed way of thinking about education, versus another very popular idea at the time was more of a behavioral approach, where we're assuming that children are not coming with good skills that just need facilitation and development, but instead we're assuming that children are blank slates and that they are not coming with any of the tools that they need, and therefore we must give them the proper tools, directly instruct them in the things that they need to form good habits. So even way back at the beginning of kindergarten, and this is really true for a school in general, we've continually had this tension between more play-based, child-centered, child-directed, project-based, experiential learning versus we must directly instruct children and have them all doing the same thing at the same time to assure that they're getting whatever habits are important to their later selves. So again, even in the mid-1900s, so 50s, 60s, 70s, etc., there was again very much this tension between hurry, 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 don't push me. So you had like third grade versus kindergarten that looked more like what we consider to be preschool, although even preschool doesn't really look that way anymore, but still present at that time. In the late 1900s to the current, we are still under the shadow of a report called A Nation at Risk, where we were just sure that all children were failing and we were failing in the race against other countries. And certainly we should go back to heavy-duty academics so that we don't get further behind. Unfortunately, the data doesn't really show that pushing the curriculum down and making things overly academic early is helpful. But the sort of powers that be and the politics that prevail often sort of win that argument and make early schooling look much more academic than more child-directed. Another potential issue is that not all folks understand that play is important. So this is not due necessarily to people not being interested in young children's development, but not everybody. So, this is, again, I've mentioned this before, this is why a class like this exists, because there may be folks who came from different educational backgrounds and have the background to teach subjects to older elementary school age children, but haven't had any coursework or content knowledge related to younger children and play-based learning and child-directed learning. So the state determined that if people want to work more exclusively with younger children, and specifically if they want to work with TK children, that you have to have some coursework in these kinds of subjects so that you can effectively serve children of that age. So that's sort of the middle bullet here, that people might just have a lack of education related to the early childhood period, or maybe when they were picking up units in child development, they did not take one specifically related to play, because the state doesn't say what 24 units of child development you have to teach younger children. It just says 24 units. So people could have put together a package of units that maybe didn't include this kind of information. And then there's sort of the camp also that really believes in the power of direct instruction and more academic learning and worksheets. And so if someone has very strong beliefs that that's the right way to educate young children, they may have a hard time hearing and absorbing information that is contrary to that, that doesn't align with their previously understood viewpoint on how the world works and how young children learn best. So many times our previous understandings and our previous beliefs color our ability to absorb new information. All humans have cognitive biases that are built into us, and one of them is difficulty taking in new information if it runs counter to previous information or beliefs that you have about how the world works. Is not having access to appropriate play spaces and materials. So I'm showing an example of an elementary school classroom in the image on this screen, and often folks are in smallish rooms, and so there may not be the kind of space needed to have play centers that are important to allowing children access to play materials. And there might not be the right kind of furniture. Furniture is expensive and you don't really get to buy your own. So if you land in a room like this that's fairly small with a bunch of desks that force children to sit at individual desks by themselves, you may not have the ability to go get different kinds of stuff. Lots of shelving is needed to have the ability to create play spaces, because you have to have shelves to put those materials on and make boundaries around your play space areas. You also need to have tables where multiple children can sit rather than individual desks. So perhaps you don't have the right kind of room or the right kind of furniture. Also, when you go outside, a lot of elementary schools don't necessarily have exactly what's needed to sort of exist out there in a more nature-based way. So maybe it's a blacktop, maybe there is grass, but it's just kind of a big expanse of grass without anything no trees, no bushes. Maybe there is a play structure, but it's sort of confined to one small area of the play yard. So, we don't always get to create the spaces that we're in, which makes it difficult to be able to do some of the kinds of things that they would like to do. Also, getting play materials is super expensive. So I taught elementary school at the beginning of my career, and that was it. That was all the play materials that I was given. It wasn't even enough for a small group of children to do anything with. So I had to create things on my own. I had to scour yard sales. It was very difficult as a new teacher with a very small pay to um, be able to have the kinds of things that I knew would be important for young children to have more play-based learning opportunities. So these are real barriers that are important to think about. And I would encourage you, as we're going through each slide, also be thinking in your mind, not just what are these barriers, but what could I potentially do to overcome some of these barriers and mitigate some of the restrictions on being able to offer play in my classroom. But this one is a little bit less exclusively about school, but I'll talk a little bit about school, but I also want to note that children's access to play in school and out of school is often restricted by concerns about safety. So people are concerned that neighborhoods are dangerous, when in reality, the data shows that neighborhoods and play spaces have become more safe across time, partly due to regulation, partly due to the fact that crime is actually lower everywhere. It doesn't look that way from the news, but it is. Some folks aren't even comfortable with kids walking to school in their own neighborhoods or playing outside in their front yards. And there may be neighborhoods where that really is not safe enough, but many children live in neighborhoods where it is safe to do those kinds of things. Also, just in general, and true as well at school, there are concerns about children getting hurt and being more active and adventuresome, kind of mildly risky kind of play. So a lot of play in neighborhoods and at schools, particularly outdoors, gets shut down to make sure that no one has a chance to, that no one gets hurt, which is good. But then it also means that no one has a chance to sort of stretch their proverbial wings a little bit and do things that probably don't lead to injury, but are just slightly risky so that children can practice those physical skills. So there can also be barriers in terms of your principal or your director. Further out from that at sort of the state or the district level. So let's talk about principals, directors first. So oftentimes principals and directors have not studied anything related to the early childhood period, which is understandable. That was not the job that they were seeking, but they are now supervising teachers and navigating classrooms in age groups that they don't really have a clear understanding of. And serving very young children in public schools is fairly new. And thinking about that we need to do that differently than we have before is also a somewhat newer idea. And so principals may not be used to thinking about younger citizens in this more play-based way. So they may create barriers just based on their lack of understanding or not really understanding how this fits into an elementary school, or continuing to evaluate their teachers with the same metrics that they use to evaluate teachers of older children. There's a lot of reasons why principals and directors might be a hindrance in being able to offer play. It also doesn't help that principals and directors are held to standards outside of their own schools. So the district may have determined that certain things are going to be important in teacher evaluation processes, or that certain things can't happen, or that there's not a certain budget for particular kinds of classrooms, or that teachers have to prove that they are meeting certain student learning outcomes. If we go out even farther than that, there might be testing at the state or the national level that teachers are held accountable to. So there's a lot in sort of this official accountability system, structure, rules world that definitely impacts what we are able to do and not do in our classrooms. And I'll be honest, this is true even at the private school level. So I'm kind of picking on public school a little bit and making it sound like the barriers are only there, but private preschools have directors who may or may not be supportive of a more play-based curriculum. There may not be ample money to outfit rooms in the way that they're needed to be outfitted to offer a healthy play-based curriculum. So this cuts across both the private and the public world. Unfortunately, you are likely not to have all of the help that you need. So often classrooms have a fair number of children in them, and they don't always have a lot of grown-ups. So this very much depends on where you work, what age group you work with, what time period you're working in. I have been alone with 22-year-olds. I have been alone with 35 first graders. I have been in classrooms where there's a 6-to-1 ratio, that there are 3 or 4 teachers for groups of 20 to 25 children. So it really just depends, and I absolutely assure you that what you are able to do depends on how many children you have in that physical space altogether and how many adults are there to spread that teaching load. And what often happens is that when you have a larger group of children, or when you are by yourself, you end up trying to do direct instruction because that seems to make sense. And I know on the surface that seems like it makes sense, but children have a harder time sitting. They have a harder time staying focused and paying attention. You're always going to have somebody who's ahead and somebody who's behind. And so in many, and behavior issues tend to escalate when children are asked to do direct instruction too early. So you may actually be creating a situation that is more difficult for yourself. As hard as it is to set up play, at least children are actively engaged and enjoying what they're doing, so that it requires less intervention from you. So just kind of food for thought there. Finally, sometimes there are time constraints. So sometimes there might not be very much time for recess. We've already talked about that recess across the country has been cut down or frighteningly even eliminated. Thank goodness we live in a state where that's a little bit better, but there just may not be that much time to access outside. Sometimes there are more strict school schedules. So I worked at a center one time where we had a play yard and multiple classrooms needed to use it, but only so many children could be on the play yard at a time. And so we had a very strict schedule. This was also combined with getting food service from an outside agency, and so we had to wait for food to come. So our lunch times, our outdoor times were very strict, and it was hard to sort of navigate a schedule around that. Or maybe you're at a school where there's a bell schedule and you just don't have a lot of choice about how much time you have for particular things. Sometimes, though, we do it to ourselves. We chop up the schedule perhaps more than we need to with younger children. We have very strict times for reading and numeracy and this and that, rather than just offering more general free choice play times that have opportunities to do all of those different kinds of learning endeavors and activities and allow children to more deeply engage. So schedules are an important thing to think about here to maximize the ability to play as much as possible. Well, yippee-ki-yay, last slide of the semester. That is very exciting. You've been through a lot of learning, and it's been such a joy to get to take this journey with you. I hope that you have learned a lot about play and how it can be actualized and what it looks like for different groups of children and different ages of children. but I thought that this was a nice article to sort of wrap up our semester of learning together. It kind of encapsulates everything that we've been talking about.